I'm very glad to introduce now our next speaker, Lea Ypi, who is Professor of Political Theory in the Government Department of the London School of Economics and Adjunct Professor in Philosophy at the Research School of Social Sciences of the Australian National University. She's the author of the book Global Justice, an Avant-Garde Political Agency, and The Meaning of Partisanship, that was co-authored with Jonathan White. And she's currently completing her new book, The Architectonic of Reason, that is forthcoming with Oxford University Press this year. She contributes regularly to The Guardian, The Statesman, and The Independent. Because of the increasing use, also in the German discourse, of the notion of class, and the importance for us of this topic, we invited Lea, and I'm very curious to hear now about how she links class with the question of immigration in favor of a new solidarity. Welcome, Lea.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here and for inviting me and accommodating me. So I'm going to talk about a progressive dilemma around the problem of immigration and about progressive skepticism on immigration, which is not rooted, or not necessarily rooted on xenophobia or racism or exclusionary attitudes like the right-wing hostility to immigration, but I think is no less troubling. And what I'm going to do today is to try and explain why I think it's troubling and maybe also hopefully end up with what could be done about making it less troubling. It's troubling because it takes both pragmatic and also principled form. The pragmatic form has to do with the fact that left-wing movements who are skeptic around immigration are increasingly on the attack by the rise of right-wing forces, increasingly far-right forces, which have made migration one of the battle horses, one of the topics that gets more and more discussed around election, in political debates, in the media, and where migrants have become scapegoats for all the problems of liberal society. And so the right is benefiting from the increase of anti-immigrant discourse and hostility in society. It's benefiting electorally, and by benefiting electorally, it's putting pressure on the left-wing forces that also compete on the electoral scene with the right, and who are therefore increasingly losing ground, losing representation in parliament, losing the ability to articulate the concerns of immigrants as a result of that pressure. So it's there's a pragmatic question around what should the left do to resist, from an electoral point of view, the rise of the right when the right is based on a discourse of anti-immigration. But I think there's also a more troubling form, which is a principled skepticism about immigration, which takes a progressive form. And I think, as it happens, that the pragmatic skepticism and the principled skepticism go hand in hand, insofar as the principled skepticism sometimes provides ground for the pragmatic skepticism. And therefore, for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus less on the strategic issues and more on the principled skepticism towards immigration that characterizes the left and often also far left discourse, the progressive discourse. So what are the two questions on which left-wing skepticism about immigration are framed? There's two concerns. The one is a distributive concern, and the other one is a cultural concern. So the distributive concern is a concern about the fact that it seems like immigrants increasingly put pressure on the ability of welfare states to deliver goods for all those who claim access to these goods, whether it's social housing, whether it's welfare benefits, where it's health benefits. It looks like just a sheer number of immigrants accessing these services puts pressure on the ability of these services to deliver for more and more people. And the cultural skepticism takes a different form, and the idea is that when a homogeneous political culture is challenged by migrants who are seemingly coming from different areas with different political cultures and so on, the ability of the welfare state to be grounded on practices of trust and solidarity on which it has been traditionally grounded in order to be able to sustain the commitment to deliver these goods to all of those who claim those goods is also increasingly challenged, because the trust and solidarity, the practices of trust and solidarity on which the welfare state is based for its functioning seem to also be eroded. So both of these questions are at the heart of contemporary debates around migration, and in particular at the heart of how left-wing political theorists, political movements, activists, political parties respond and frame their responses in the public sphere when responding to immigration questions. And the empirical evidence is controversial around both of them. It's not clear empirically that either of these things is the case, that A, the welfare state really is unable to deliver on its goods from a distributive perspective when there is immigration pressure. And also, it seems to be empirically also dubious that the welfare state really is eroded in the practice of trust and solidarity that underpin it in order to deliver these goods. But the problem is that from a political perspective, it doesn't really matter what the research says, because in the age of fake news and social media and hoo-ha about all kinds of discourses, it doesn't really matter what the objective evidence is, so long as the political discourse is flourishing around these claims being made in the public sphere, and so long as there are actors in society that benefit from these claims flourishing. So far, the response to these questions, to both of these questions, on the side of progressives have been to start talking about the model of nation-state solidarity that underpins these claims, and to come up with responses that extend that model of solidarity to two other ways of thinking about the political community, which I'm going to articulate and respond to in a moment. And then I think characterized also by a neglect of a third model, which is the one that is going to be at the heart of what my considerations are going to speak to, namely a class-based model of solidarity. So what I'm going to try and say in the next few minutes is that in the efforts of the left or of progressive movements in society to respond to skepticism about immigration, all efforts have gone into thinking about the nation-state model of solidarity and how to readapt this nation-state model of political cooperation to deal with the challenges of globalization by offering models of political community that are alternatives to the nation-state model. And what I want to try and do is to say that I think it's wrong for the left to go down this route. It's wrong for the left to think about political community and to think about the practices of political cooperation in a political community that would enable it to respond to the challenges of migration, and that what the left should really do is go back to what the left has traditionally done, which is to recuperate discourses of social class and the importance of thinking about social class from a transnational perspective in order to respond to the dilemma around immigration. And what I'm also going to try and show is that once we make that move, once progressive political movements and theorists in society reflect on class-based models of solidarity, then we will see that migration is not really a problem after all, that it's only a way, a prism through which we look at either other problems in society, that there's questions of global justice and injustice, that there's questions around the feasibility and the sustainability of capitalism and liberalism as the kind of intellectual discourse that underpins it, that should really be at the heart of the challenge for the left. And that if the left and progressive movements in society were able to recuperate this discourse around migration, which is based on the centrality of social class, it would also be able to uncover a different way of thinking about globalization and thinking about society more generally, and also to uncover a kind of more radical alternative to the status quo from the one that has been pursued so far, which has been mostly playing catch with what liberals or what the right has been presenting. So let me first start by talking, so this is the structure of what I'm going to say. First, I'm going to talk about the two alternative models of political community that progressives advocate in responding to immigration challenges. And then in the last part, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the class-based model of solidarity as an alternative to these ways of talking about political community, and also as an alternative and as a way of solving some of the questions that emerge if we think more carefully about the dilemmas and the contradictions and the conflicts within these two alternative models of political community. And I'm going to call these two alternative models a multicultural model on the one hand and the supranational model on the other. And then my one, as I say, it's called the class-based model. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what I see as the promises of these two models, the multicultural one and the supranational one, and then also what I see as the kind of remainders and exclusions that they generate also in this adapted version. So as I see it, the main shortcoming of the multicultural and the supranational models of solidarity is that rather than challenging the idea of political community that is at the heart of the nation-state model, which is the one that we currently have, they try to either internally differentiate it or to extend it. So what is the multicultural model? Both of them rely on an ideal of cooperation as rooted in the traditional combination of territory, sovereignty, and population, which is embedded in the nation state as we know it. And both try to say that the nation state as we know it is unable to cope with the challenges of globalization, with the pressures from migration, international mobility, distributive pressures, and so on. And so we need to rethink the nation state, and we need to come up with alternative conditions and conceptions of political community to the nation state one. One of those is the multicultural model, which basically takes the nation-state model of solidarity as a basis, but then thinks about the internal differentiation of that model and how we could make it work by taking into account the diversity of representation that the current nation state needs to confront. And so we say, when we're thinking about multicultural solidarity, that since one of the concerns that come with migration is the cultural concern, the idea of internal differentiation of the population, then what we need to do from a multicultural perspective is to render the nation state more internally diverse. And so people like Will Kymlicka, for example, political theorists, have talked at length about how it is possible to revise this nation-state model by making space for representation of various different other political communities, different political cultures within the multicultural model. And the other one, the supranational model, tries to extend the idea of political community. And so this is if you think about, for example, models of political cooperation based on the European Union, the idea is that because the nation state as we know it is unable to respond to the challenges of globalization in an isolated way, we need more transnational cooperation, we need more international cooperation between the states, and therefore we need to rethink what has held together the nation state historically and be able to extend what has held together the nation state historically to the supranational sphere by rendering it larger. So one goes deeper and it differentiates internally by thinking about incorporating different cultures, and the other one goes wider and extends externally, so thinks about expanding the realm of representation. Both of them, however, are grounded on the two elements that have traditionally held together the nation state, which is the idea of popular sovereignty on the one hand and civic education on the other. So popular sovereignty is the idea of democratic representation, the idea that all those who are part of a political community make laws that are democratically accountable to the citizens of that community, and therefore are able to kind of coercively enforce the laws that they make. And that they also require civic education, traditional political culture, in order to make these laws more feasible. So, and to make them sustainable in the long run by creating cultural cooperation. So, both the multicultural model and the supranational model don't challenge that part of the nation-state argument. So they both also require popular sovereignty on the one hand and civic education on the other. And both emphasize, in a way, the limitations of the nation-state so far and try to incorporate these challenges of the nation state and extend or internally differentiate these challenges. What is interesting, however, is that neither of these models really challenges or really tackles the idea of obligations of social justice that apply only within the members of a particular cooperative unit and not others. So if you're thinking about, again, the combination of popular sovereignty and civic education, the idea is that the state is a political unit in which we have more obligations of social justice to the members of this cooperative unit than we have to other people with whom we are not related, who may be outside. Neither of these models challenges this ideal of cooperation, and they in fact think that this ideal of cooperation is essential to advance democratic struggles within the newly formed cooperative political units, and therefore all they try to do is to expand the range of social obligations, or as I say, to internally differentiate them. So the appeal to, say, shared language and history and tradition that has given the kind of resources traditionally for discharging these obligations of social justice within the nation state is tackled, is at the center of these two other models, and it's reformed. But the idea that the political community operates on the basis of this political cooperation, that democracy is about ever-expanding inclusion, that it is about ever-expanding concern, and that it is about the idea that members of this political unit cooperate with each other more than they cooperate with those who are excluded by these political units is central to both these other models. So what is the problem with these two models is that they both generate their own their own exclusions, and that they are also reliant on a historically inaccurate idea of how the nation state represents generally and how it includes those it has traditionally excluded. So let me say a couple of words on each of them. In the case of the multicultural model, why are there remainders of exclusion? Because it is based on a particular conception of what a political culture is, which is again reliant on this traditional combination of territory, sovereignty, and population. And it may end up marginalizing and excluding other kinds of representation and other kinds of thinking, other ways of thinking about culture, which are not necessarily and neatly overlapping with the way in which we have traditionally thought about what makes up a culture politically. And in the case of supranational institutions, there are also remainders of exclusion because, as I said, the idea that we have more obligations to the members of this unit than we have to members who are outside this unit is also central to the supranational model of cooperation. So if you think about what would be an example of a boosted up supranational model of political cooperation, the European Union, for example, were the European Union to have more sovereignty or to have more stronger practices of cooperation between members, to have more authority over the exercise of jurisdiction by its member states, it would still leave out all those who are not part of the borders of this new reformed political unit. And in fact, the examples of, for example, European Union border management and control, the way in which it, for example, co-opts client states to create detention camps on which it relies in North Africa to exclude migrants there, would still be part of that newly reformed model of political cooperation because it would still have to defend its borders in a particular way. So in both these accounts, these reformed accounts of solidarity post-nation states, as it were, the idea is that they rely on an ideal of social cooperation that is relatively insensitive to the asymmetries of wealth, power, and resources that have traditionally shaped the emergence of the nation-state model of cooperation. And so, in other words, both of these models are based on the emergence of a kind of social solidarity and a way of telling the story of social solidarity that would have been warranted if the nation-state had ever worked in a way in which these reforms of the nation-state tell us it has worked, and if the liberal democratic state had ever really been a liberal democratic state in the way in which the models describe it. So the problem is that the liberal democratic state has neither been fully liberal nor fully democratic. It has historically consolidated in parallel with the development of global civil society and the expansion of global market practices that have engendered and structures that have engendered and entrenched their own forms of exclusion and marginalization, whether it was in the case of domestic workers, for example, or in the case of people in the colonies, or in the case of women. So except for a few rare and unfortunate episodes, the liberal democratic state has been always the site of struggle, political struggle, rather than the site of political cooperation between those that were subjected to the power of its laws, and where the ideas of nation, of shared compliance with particular norms, of a tradition that makes complying ever more easy, has always been instrumental to the consolidation of particular liberal elite projects, which have come at the expense of the subordination of vulnerable minorities, both within the domestic state and outside the state. So within, with the case of women, people of color, and workers, and internationally is the case of, again, the same subjects, but in the colonies. So I think when we think about the progressive dilemma, when we think about the way in which we should tackle challenges of immigration from the point of view of a left perspective, we need to think about the political cooperation and the political units on which these challenges are confronted as they are and as they have been historically, rather than as they are in our ideals and in our dreams of what we would have liked these political communities to be historically. So this means thinking outside the kind of idealization and inaccuracies of the nation-state model of cooperation, which is central to these multicultural and supranational models, and to give a more realistic and more historically nuanced account of how these practices of cooperation have really emerged historically. And I think an alternative and more nuanced historical account would actually be more sensitive to the way in which solidarity has emerged not from the cooperation of groups who are all committed to these ideas of nation and democracy and equal representation, but as a result of the social struggle between different social groups, and in particular between elites and the groups that they have historically subjected, by thinking about the particular configuration of power relations within particular episodes in history. And so we need to think about solidarity not as recognition of common national political norms, but rather as the condition that is shared by all those who fight oppression in a particular form. And so the shared action of all those who have experienced this oppression and who have historically struggled against this oppression. So a historically more nuanced account of this political pressure would show us that solidarity is not grounded on a particular ethnic or cultural solidarity, or in particular an ethic of social membership, but that it is rather based on the political coordinated effort to develop the joint political resources that are necessary to overcome shared oppression. So basically, this would begin to point towards an alternative model, which is the one that I'm going to articulate and explore in a minute, which is a class-based model of solidarity, where we see that solidarity emerges out of a condition of shared oppression in the struggle against the oppressors, as opposed to solidarity as emerging out of commitment to particular norms of, as I say, popular sovereignty or civic education, which are the ones that shape the nation-state model. So sometimes scholars who work in either of these alternative models recognize that social class has also played a role in solidarity formation. And they say, yeah, it's true. Historically, we can concede that this is how it has happened. The genealogy of the problem is different from its justification. And so they might say, yes, we concede that shared oppression has played an important role, but where we are at now, it's no longer relevant. What we have to look forward to is how we have created mechanisms of universal inclusion and participation. We have created democracy, and it's now the commitment to democracy that drives this. So this is a way of telling the story about the relationship between the class model of solidarity and the supranational and multicultural model, which tries to reconcile the two by granting that the historical story that I've been telling is accurate, but by saying that when we look forward, we need to think about an alternative, and where the alternative takes the form of the multicultural or the supranational model. But I think it's very difficult to do that because the models are not only incompatible, they actually point against each other. And I think this is what the left needs to, in a way now, progressive actors in society who really want to tackle the question of immigration as a form of social exclusion. What they need to think about is how what they say about migration from the point of view of the endorsement of this model of political community actually undermines what might be said about migration if one were to look at the problem from the point of view of social class. Because on the one hand, these are two different models of political community that are underpinning these models. On the multicultural and supranational one, we have the idea of cooperation between members of a particular political unit, where then cooperation generates particularly strong social obligations. And on the other hand, we have an idea of a political community that is based on conflict, and where the exercise of political power is what shapes the particular configuration of forces in society. And so on this account, on the kind of class-based model, what we think as solidarity emerging out of a condition of shared oppression is accounted for by thinking about the relevance that social class plays in emancipatory political struggles. Now, what is a social class and what social class means in current conditions is obviously a very controversial topic, and we can talk about it later during the questions. But on my account, at least, classes should be understood as neither pre-existing political groups with given material interests that the left or that progressive actors just go and try to represent, take these interests as they are and try to represent them politically, nor are they contingent aggregates of social opportunities. So they're something in between, and it's where the work of the political theorists and also the political theorists who want to be politically active in society in helping shape political forces deal with the way in which these migration dilemmas arise. This is where the work needs to be done in articulating an account of social class that, as I say, it's neither purely materialistic, where their social class is not just all those who are subject to these pure material forces, nor is it purely idealistic in the sense of thinking about classes as just social constructions, where the work is in trying to go back and forth between these two models. So, in the class-based model, what does the class-based model tell us about migration? And how might one look at the problem of migration by thinking about the centrality of social class in defining what power is and what community is and how we think about the emergence of democratic norms? On the class-based model, migration is not a problem as such. It's only a problem in the context of particular global injustices and in the context of a global process of production and distribution of social goods that is shaped by the circulation of capital and where the distinctive national and global juridical and political relations that enable that model of cooperation make a difference in terms of social membership. So on the class-based model, the asymmetries of power and wealth that globalization under capitalism generates continuously produce social conflicts. And these social conflicts are importantly take place both at the domestic level and at the international level. So there is a dynamic of social class that plays in within particular political communities, but also between particular political communities. And so the way different classes of people are affected by these conflicts is also different. And that's why migration is not a problem in general. It's only a problem if one thinks about questions of exclusion, distribution, and poverty, and so on. When we talk about migrants, what we really mean is not rich migrants. What we really mean when we talk about migrants is the poor migrants who put pressure on the poor citizens of receiving states because of the dynamic of exclusion that processes of globalization put in motion, both in particular advanced capitalist democracies, but also at the periphery, which has enabled historically the advanced capitalist democracies to progress and move forward. So poor citizens of rich countries and poor citizens of poor countries are adversely affected by similar phenomena of globalization, of deindustrialization, of digitalization, by productivity crisis, even though they may not be affected in the same measure. So it's not a puzzle that a worker in Germany is materially better off than a worker in Ghana or in Albania, where I come from. What is interesting is that both of them are in the same position of vulnerability to global processes of capital production and circulation, and that rich citizens of rich countries and rich citizens of poor countries are also, perhaps in terms of wealth, not the same, but also on the winning side of particular conflicts that again have to do with the way in which processes of production and distribution of capital take shape in particular nation states. So so we can concede that there's a great degree of variation in how particular states respond to these challenges. But what is important to realize is that the challenges in a structural way present themselves similarly in all these different contexts. Or at least that's what a class-based argument around globalization and around migration would have to say. So what are the implications of thinking about migration from the perspective of globalization and global capitalism and the challenges that global capitalism gives us? Well, one immediate implication is that on the multicultural and supranational model, an immigrant worker and a domestic worker are distinguished by their political membership, so by the culture that they belong to. When we look at them, we think about the states that they come from. We think about the color of their passports. We think about their cultural differences. And where, on that account, the relevant social movements that have shaped the emergence of the welfare state have stronger obligations of social justice to cater to domestic workers than they have to excluded international workers. And incidentally, this is one of the arguments that pervades left-wing rhetoric against open borders, is to say, look, if we open borders, then workers in welfare states will be suffering because their wages will go down, because immigration will put pressure on their wages and so on. So what we think about is how ethnic membership defines the different position of workers. On the class-based model, agents in society who defend the concerns of workers from a universal perspective have no reason to be troubled by the particular form that political membership takes. If you care about social class, you care about social class universally. You don't care about workers in Germany as opposed to workers in Ghana or in Albania. You care about workers in general. And then it's a pragmatic question how you then develop the struggle in favor and in support of these workers in each of these different countries. But what is important is that since the axes of conflict are global, and since the asymmetries of power that conducive to these emergencies of these asymmetries and to global processes of connection, of circulation of capital, then it's these contradictions that are responsible for why migration is perceived as a problem in the first place. And so the response to the conflict should also be global rather than based on isolated national cases. So this is why the fact that progressive left-wing forces in liberal democracies, especially liberal democracies that try to defend the welfare state, are reluctant to defend migrants, isn't just explicable on pragmatic grounds. It hasn't to do just with the fact that the left is trying to win elections, and you can't win elections these days if you defend the migrants because everybody is against migrants. I think there's a principled argument which has to do with the model of political community that the progressive left has come to endorse, and with the abandonment of this alternative, older-fashioned and more traditional way of thinking about social mobilization, which is the one based on class, that used to shape struggles of the left, that has been progressively abandoned, and where the global struggle against capital has been relegated in second place. It's more a question of defending your national community or defending democracy in your national community, or adapting that model of national community to these, to take into account of the challenges of globalization by thinking about these other two alternatives that I have just described. So, and there's of course also a kind of structural argument which has to do with the way in which we have arranged political power relations within the nation state, makes it also very difficult for actors in the left to include immigrants, because trade unions take a national form, because elections are run at a national level, because in order to put pressure on the state, you have to be a citizen of that state. It's very difficult for those who are excluded, who don't have citizenship, to put pressure on the state, where these arguments around inclusion and enfranchisement that used to play historically a pivotal role in the emergence of the left can no longer be made, because citizenship is no longer a site of political emancipation. Citizenship now is a vehicle of exclusion rather than a vehicle of political mobilization. So where the dominant models of political cooperation and solidarity make space for class-based considerations, they do it by saying that it's in principle possible to pursue strategies of solidarity that are based on political membership and strategies of solidarity based on social class at the same time. But I think it's very difficult to do these things, and this is really where I'm trying to go with this argument. It's very difficult to do both. It's very difficult to be both on the side of the state and on the side of an understanding of political solidarity that is based on class. Because to make a case for class solidarity, one has to show the shortcomings of alternative ways of thinking about the nation state, where the main obstacle consists in the very acceptance of the terms of the dilemma as it is presented to us. Once we concede that migration is a problem, once we are into it is a problem but we shouldn't resolve it in the way in which the right resolves it, or it is a problem but we have to think about fair migration, or fair management of the problem, we think about quotas or skills-based, points-based immigration system and so. Once we are in that territory, then we have already conceded the ground. And what we have done by conceding the ground is to deprive ourselves of a mechanism of talking about solidarity in a way that is completely oblivious to how we talk about solidarity when we think about political community and the elements that hold up together political community. So this is why it's really important to talk about migration in a different way. And I'm now going to just say two ways in which the left might be talking about migration in a way that is compatible with this class-based model of solidarity. What would the arguments have to be that we could make in the public sphere in challenging right-wing discourses on migration without conceding that migration is a problem of social membership or an ethics of political membership? So I think the first one concerns migration in its relationship to the genealogy of the welfare states. What would a progressive argument that concedes the role of migration and the relationship to the welfare state have to look like? I think it would be really difficult to talk about the reality, the contemporary reality of migration, without talking about the legacy of colonialism on the peoples and the sites from which migrants come in the first place. So this is another really important element. When we talk about migrants, we typically talk about vulnerable subjects that come from areas that have experienced colonialism and historical injustice. It's not migrants from not migrants from Norway that are a problem in Germany. So it's usually the migrants who come from states that have experienced historically European colonialism, and that in experiencing European colonialism have also benefited the emergence of the particular forms of liberalism that then have become dominant after the Second World War in Europe. So what is often forgotten is the way in which historical injustice has contributed to the accumulation of benefits, resources, and power that has entrenched then the further distribution of these relations in the contemporary juridical and legal system. So when we think about how does migration affect the welfare state, the first thing we have to think about is how migration has contributed to the ability of states to deliver on the goods of the welfare state by being able to benefit on the labor of migrants and by being able to experience on the historical exclusion and historical colonialism, the kind of trade, slave trade and so on, that has brought liberal states to the point in which they are. So one question is about historical injustice. The second question is to think about the legacy of that historical injustice on the contemporary institutions that we have. Because colonialism, even though it's formally over, even though formerly colonized states are formally self-determining, they are still at the mercy of their former colonial masters when it comes to the asymmetries that shape the international sphere. And this is something that you really need to know when you come from from the periphery. You really see this in any form. You see it in the form of trade deals, where former colonizers have always the upper hand in deciding who makes certain deals with certain countries, how existing client states behave as a response of pressure from their former colonial master, in the form of unequal development, in the form of debt dependency, in the form of continuing dependency on brain drain, in the fact of the continuing exploitation of labor force from these countries when it continues to benefit the kind of rich core. So working class struggles that have shaped the welfare state as we know it for decent pay and welfare rights and so on have of course historically played a really important role in consolidating the social justice that has pervaded the welfare states. But I think it would be naive to dismiss the structural conditions under which those struggles have emerged historically, and the fact that the asymmetric shape of the current international order is one key element for why welfare states were able to deliver the goods that they have been delivering so far. And the second issue that speaks to the relevance of solidarity based on class has to do not so much with the historical injustice, but with the predicament that we have now. So not just with the effects of historical injustice in the present, but also on social class, the role of social class in present political dynamics. So the progressive dilemma emphasizes how immigration is especially a problem for vulnerable citizens of rich liberal states, and highlights how it often benefits wealthy citizens of these liberal states. When we say if you open borders, it's the poor workers that will lose out and the employers will win. But this way of looking at the question is a way that pits the claims of domestic workers against the claims of migrant workers and presents us a kind of distorted understanding of the role of social class in this relationship. So this is, again, connected to a kind of more general analysis of the process of global capital accumulation and the role of liberal states in enabling that process of capitalist accumulation. So what we have to understand is to understand that when we think about global capitalist development, when we think about the development of capitalism, what we have is a political conflict that is not a conflict between different states. The conflict between different states is epiphenomenal. It's an implication of a deeper, more important structurally fundamental conflict, which is a conflict between different social classes, between the classes of capitalists, those who benefit the accumulation and circulation of capital, and those who lose out from that process. And so this is one of the ways in which an analysis of social class departs from an analysis based on the centrality of nation states, because from the point of view of the class-based account, what we do when we think about political cooperation along the lines of the nation-state model is we benefit a particular way of talking about social conflicts, and we lose another way of talking about social conflicts, which is the one that pervades the development of global capitalism. So the political membership model is not equipped to fix these asymmetries because it emphasizes contractual agreements rather than conflict between different social classes. And instead, what we have to think about when we analyze global commercial society, we have to think about the main axis of conflict as one that is not premised on nations and states, but on different social classes, where different social classes demarcate different collective alignments with regard to, as I say, processes of production and distribution. So class conflicts cut across state boundaries. And if the left were to recuperate the centrality of social class and think about migration, it would also have to recuperate a discourse around class that focuses on this way of antagonism. And where the moral weight of the distinction between migrant workers and domestic workers is parasitic on the moral weight of the identification of the case of workers with the workers in the state in which they operate. So it's only if we think that we have to only defend the interests of workers in the state in which they operate that they then can be distinguished by migrant workers. If you don't think states matter from a moral perspective, then there's no reason to be concerned more about domestic workers than it is about migrant workers. And the problem is that this progressive dilemma creates a kind of artificial we between a community that needs to be protected, domestic workers that have certain rights and benefits that have to be defended historically, and it creates a kind of them, which is the foreign workers, that need to be controlled by managing migration, by thinking about border practices and so on. Now, this opposition, and this is really where I will conclude, this opposition between foreign and domestic workers is based on a kind of reification of the role of the state in thinking about processes of globalization. And this is, Marx said when he talked about it in thinking about the relationship between Irish migrants in the United Kingdom and English workers, he said that this pitting of domestic workers versus migrant workers is the secret of why the working class is powerless, globally speaking. The fact that it endorses this distinction between us and them, between a community to which we belong and a community that we have to exclude and control. When class-based solidarity is weak, the prospects of joint action and solidarity based on social class are also very weak. And this division then ends up playing in the hands of the upper forces, of the elites of particular receiving states that benefit from cheap labor, that benefit from migration, and that also benefit by artificially keeping alive this distinction between domestic workers and foreign workers, which is then further intensified, and this is again something that Marx already remarked, is intensified by the media, by academia, by intellectual discourses around migration, and so by all the means, Marx says it's a citation, by all the means in disposal of the ruling class. So just to wrap up, the real threat to labor movements, if we think about what matters to the left, what matters to progressive actors in society, are not foreign migrant workers. And the real threat are also not open borders. It is false to say that open borders pose a problem for vulnerable migrant workers. Under capitalism, employers don't favor the movement of people as such. What they favor is the movement of people without rights. If migrants were protected, if they had access to bargaining schemes, to trade unions, to citizenship, to all the means of political empowerment that the nation state has given to its traditionally marginalized peoples, then migrants wouldn't be something that would benefit the development of elites domestically. So liberal elites favor the movement of people without rights, and this is why it's really important in defending migrants, so defending the rights of migrants and not migrants as such, not migrants in general. When we talk about migration, we need to think about the injustices that migration engenders and incorporates, rather than migration as just a problem of movement of people from one place to the other. So they favor the movement of people without rights, and they also favor the development of an agency like the capitalist state, or a state-like institution, as in the multicultural model or in the supranational model, that can unilaterally control practices of entry and access, and therefore renders both migrant workers and domestic workers vulnerable to the discretion of ruling elites. So, to separate problems of immigrant admission and problems of integration, to campaign for the rights of existing migrants, but not against current state policies of border control and migration management, strengthens the capitalist state and disempowers workers, both migrant workers and domestic workers. And to endorse the terms of the progressive dilemma, as I have tried to introduce it, is to accept not that we must be reasonable and acknowledge that we can't open borders, that not everyone come in, but is to kind of think about the exclusion of migrants from the workplace and from access to welfare rights in a way in which it is enabled by a capitalist state that is strengthened when we think about migration in those terms. So the threat to domestic workers and to migrant workers is a capitalist state which protects the interests of its ruling elites through practices of border management and control, and policies of integration that render migrant workers vulnerable to domestic employers. And the shared vulnerability of both that is displayed in the endorsement of an authority like the authority of the state is why the ruling elites are able to capitalize on these conflicts by pitting these workers against each other to then advance and continue to make profit without really being systematically and systemically challenged at the core. So the management of migration by capitalist states is, and the kind of division that it introduces between domestic workers and foreign workers, is a secret, Marx says, by which the capitalist state maintains its power. And the capitalist class, Marx also says at some point, is fully aware of this. It's fully aware of the benefits that thinking about migration in those terms confers on its ability to maintain its privileges. But without challenging the model of solidarity that is at the core of the nation state and of the ability that the nation state has to capitalize on these conflicts, it's going to be very difficult to unravel that riddle and to kind of unpack that secret and what goes on, the kind of mystique around border control and border management. Because where solidarity is constructed as allegiance to a kind of joint cooperative process of nation-state will formation, then the alternative model, that which is based on social class, ends up being inevitably undermined. So just to conclude, this is called Performing Society. So just to conclude with a slogan that is the takeaway point from this lecture, I guess the slogan would be, don't fight migrants, fight capitalism. Thank you.